Rain slammed the bulletproof windows of St. Jude's VIP wing, while the heart monitor in room 404 kept ticking like a verdict. Graham Kessler owned half of Chicago's shadows, but he couldn't buy his mother's next breath or force his father's eyes to open. 6 months after the accident he knew was a warning. The city feared him, his enemies disappeared, and still the only answer he got was that steady beep. That morning, Doctor. Sloane said the word no one dared say to his face: hospice, and for the first time Graham felt something worse than rage. Helplessness. Then the elevator chimed. Calm footsteps. No hesitation. A new night shift nurse walked straight toward his door with a chart under one arm and a small speaker in the other, as if she hadn't heard the stories about the man inside. 2 security guards blocked her. She didn't blink. "I'm assigned to this room," she said. "I'm doing my job. Step aside. Like, share, and subscribe, so you don't miss what happens when she finally crosses that threshold, because the moment she enters room 404, everything changes." Tessa Halbrook stepped across the threshold of room 404 with a walk that wasn't hurried and wasn't cautious, as if this were just another ordinary shift, and the rumors out in the corridor were nothing but noise. The air held the sharp, cold bite of disinfectant. The white lights were bright enough to ache behind the eyes, and the steady beep of the heart monitor hung in the room like a sentence that hadn't been signed yet. On the 2 beds, Evelyn Kessler and Howard Kessler lay unmoving, their skin pale beneath thin blankets, each breath lifted and released by machines as if life itself were being held in place by invisible threads. Tessa set the chart on the table, keeping her hands steady the way you learn to do after nights that run longer than you'd ever want to remember. She didn't look at Graham right away. She looked at the 2 patients first, as if they were the ones who deserved to be greeted before anyone else. "Good evening, Mrs. Evelyn. Mr. Howard, I'm Tessa, your night shift nurse. I'll be taking care of you tonight. If anything feels uncomfortable, if anything doesn't feel right, I'll be here," she said, her voice clear enough to fill the cold hollow of the room. Then she began to work, each movement measured, almost ritual. "I'm going to check your readings first," she went on, not asking Graham for permission, but speaking as though to the person lying in the bed. She leaned in, studied the monitor, traced the IV line with her eyes, watched the numbers flicker and hold, her gaze passing over it all like someone reading a map in the dark. "I'm going to raise your pillow a little so you can breathe easier," she said, and gently lifted Evelyn's shoulders, sliding the pillow into the right position. "I'm going to check your hand. If you're too cold, I'll turn the warmth up," she said, then placed 2 fingers on the wrist without a trace of hurry, as if that fragile pulse deserved reverence. When she pulled the blanket higher, she smoothed every fold, not for neatness, but out of kindness, because she believed that even someone who couldn't open their eyes could still feel the care. Everything moved in a controlled silence until the man's voice behind her cut through it like a blade. "Stop." Graham didn't step closer, but his presence filled the room the way darkness presses down on light. He wanted her to know this was his territory, wanted her to shrink automatically, the way everyone else always did. Tessa lifted her head and, for the first time, looked straight at him. His stare wasn't the hot kind of anger that flares. It was cold and deep, the cold of a man used to giving orders and used to watching people obey. If it had been someone else, they might have apologized, explained, taken a step back. Tessa did none of those things. She calmly set both hands on the bed rail, kept the proper professional distance, and asked the only question that mattered. "Which step do you want me to stop, Mr. Kessler?" The way she used his name wasn't flattery. It was a boundary drawn in plain sight. "In here, you're family, and I'm the nurse." He wasn't used to being placed inside a frame he didn't build. He moved half out of the shadow, just enough for the light to sharpen the hard lines of his face. "I don't need you putting on a show. I don't need these little games, talking to people in a coma." His words hit the floor like stones. Tessa didn't argue. She didn't challenge him with reckless heat, either. She answered as if she were reading from protocol. Because protocol is the one thing power can't bend with a bare hand. "I'm not performing," she said, low and even. "I'm doing what needs to be done." And then she let a sentence into the air that made Graham hesitate, whether he wanted to or not. Hearing is often the last thing to go. Sometimes people don't respond, don't open their eyes, but they still hear a voice they know. They still recognize the rhythm of it. They still know who's beside them. It wasn't a cheap promise. It was a reminder that there are doors you can't see, and the only way you know they still exist is if you knock the right way. Graham looked at her the way he looked at someone who had just made a deadly mistake. He'd taken revenge. He'd made an entire city afraid of him. But he couldn't make this room shift even a fraction of an inch. And this girl, in a night shift uniform with a voice that didn't shake, had the nerve to tell him there was still a door that wasn't closed. He hated that feeling, hated the thin strand of hope she'd pulled out of the dark. "Who are you to dare?" he said. Tessa didn't answer with a sob story. She turned back to the monitor, checked the line again, and replied with clean precision. "I'm the nurse assigned to this room. I'll complete the checks, change the IV bag, document their condition, and make sure they're comfortable. If you want to discuss the treatment plan with the doctor, you can do that tomorrow morning. But on this shift, the clinical responsibility is mine." That was when Graham's eyes dropped to her hands. No jewelry, no long nails, nothing decorative. Working hands. Hands that had touched people balanced between living and dying. She wasn't frightening, but she wasn't easy to break either. He turned toward his security guard as if he could end the conversation by pure force. "Replace her. Tonight." His voice wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Tessa stayed where she was. No reaction, no pleading, no defense. That was the first feint that landed on Graham. He'd been waiting for a tear, an apology, a retreat. There was nothing. Just a silence as straight as a ruler. A few minutes later, the door opened again. Lena Park, the head nurse, came in with a face that looked both scared and exhausted. The exhaustion of someone who spends her life balancing human storms. She glanced at Graham, then at Tessa, as if measuring who might explode first. "Mr. Kessler," Lena said quietly, "I understand your request, but we can't replace her tonight. The night team is short. The other rooms are already stretched. Tessa was assigned here because she's ICU certified and experienced with coma patients. Her record is clean. No errors. No complaints." Graham's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to hearing can't. He wasn't used to hearing clean spoken like a wall. Lena hurried on, as if afraid her own words would wake his fangs. "I'll make sure everything follows protocol. If you want, tomorrow morning I'll try to rearrange the schedule. But tonight, for the safety of both patients, she should stay." Graham said nothing. He looked at the two beds, then back at Tessa. In that moment, his power slammed into something else that wasn't soft and wasn't hard. It was simply right, and he hated right most of all when it didn't belong to him. Tessa finished the last steps, changed the IV bag, wrote down the readings, adjusted the tubing, wiped a faint trace of moisture at the corner of Howard's mouth, as if he could feel the loneliness of being left unattended. She pulled the curtain partway, so the light wouldn't stab straight into the eyes of someone lying motionless, then looked at Graham again, not intimate and not defiant. "I'll be right outside if you need me, but I'll come back on the schedule for checks," she said. Then she picked up the chart and walked out. At the door, she paused for the briefest beat, as if weighing something, then lifted a small speaker with her other hand, holding it neatly like an ordinary piece of equipment, offering no explanation. The door closed so gently it barely made a sound, but in the room, one sentence remained, like an echo clinging to skin. Graham stood still, his eyes drifting toward the leather chair between the two beds, the place where he'd bowed his head in helplessness before. He didn't sit. He just stared at the spot where Tessa had disappeared, then stared at the speaker in his memory as if it were an unopened secret. What did a night shift nurse need that for? And why had she brought it into room 404 as if she'd been preparing for something all along? Morning arrived in a pale gray light that crept along the upper floor corridor, as if the whole hospital didn't dare turn the lights up too bright in the face of the despair lying still inside room 404. Tessa had just finished the night shift. Her eyes stung dry from lack of sleep, but her hand kept writing with careful precision, like someone who wouldn't allow herself to loosen, not even for a second. She stood at the corner of the room as the doctors filed in, white coats, rigid clipboards, soft coughs, and rubber-soled shoes tapping the floor with the cold, procedural sound of routine. "Doctor." Martin Sloane led the group, his face so calm it was almost blank, the kind of calm that belongs to a man who's had to say cruel sentences too many times to survive in this job. He set a stack of papers on the table beside the bed, not looking at Graham, looking straight down at the chart. "We need to discuss the long-term care plan," he said evenly. "This VIP unit isn't designed for long-term care. The hospital requires the family to make a decision within 48 hours about transfer arrangements and palliative care." The last words dropped like rolling stones. No one needed an explanation to understand what they really meant. On the other side of the bed, Graham stood perfectly still. There was no flare of anger now, no threats, no stare that forced other people to lower their heads. There was only an emptiness opening behind his cold eyes, as if something inside him had just fallen and made no sound. Tessa saw that collapse more clearly than anyone, because she'd learned to recognize the moment a person loses their anchor, no matter how carefully they hide it. Doctor. Sloane kept talking about quality of life, about prognosis, about pain management, about how family members should prepare themselves. Every sentence was correct, and every sentence was also a cut, because it went straight into the one place where Graham had no power. Graham stayed silent too long. Head nurse Lena Park stood nearby with her pen clenched tight, as if she feared the air itself might crack. Then Graham spoke, his voice low, rougher than usual, not asking for numbers, not asking for statistics, not asking about percentages, asking only one question that made the whole room stall. Who benefits if I give up? The question wasn't aimed at medicine. It was aimed at the world outside, where everything always has someone pulling strings. Doctor. Sloane blinked, as if he wasn't sure whether he should answer or pretend he hadn't heard. Lena held her breath. A resident dropped his gaze into his clipboard. Tessa looked at Graham and understood that in his mind, hospice wasn't only an option, it was an exit that would open the door for enemies to walk in. Dr. Sloane recovered his clinical tone, trying to keep the conversation within a safe boundary. This is a hospital requirement based on ICU length of stay and treatment criteria, he said. It isn't connected to anyone else. Graham didn't respond. He stared down at the papers like a pre-printed sentence waiting for a signature. On the bed, Evelyn still lay motionless, her chest rising and falling steadily. Machines holding the rhythm of life, the way they held a story that refused to end. Howard was the same, still in a way that hurt to witness, as if the whole room were breathing on their behalf. Tessa stepped forward by half a step, not to interrupt, only to exist, a small marker of humanity inside an exchange that had grown too cold. She said one short line, just enough to pull the conversation back from the edge. If a decision is needed, I'd like permission to update you on the night shift status, she said to Dr. Sloane, and she quickly reported the small changes she'd documented. The way Evelyn responded differently when she heard a voice. The way the numbers steadied after repositioning. Details that weren't miracles but also couldn't be called meaningless. Doctor. Sloane listened and nodded out of courtesy. But his eyes didn't move from the position of a man being chased by time. When the doctors left, room 404 suddenly felt larger, colder, because those words, 48 hours, still hung in the air like a noose. Graham stood there for a moment, then turned to Tessa. His gaze was no longer the straight blade it had been last night. It was something worn down, carved deep with fatigue, as if he'd just fought himself and lost. You did well, he said, the words sounding like a reluctant admission. He pulled a card from his wallet and set it on the table beside the chart, the motion decisive, like a habit of solving everything with value. This is for you, for the trouble, for having to deal with this room. In that moment, Tessa understood this was how Graham kept distance. He didn't know how to say thank you in its real form, so he paid in money, in the one thing he believed would always work. She looked at the card for a second, then slid it back with her fingertip, gentle but unmistakable. Pay your hospital bill, she said, not harsh, not preaching, just a sentence that said a line. And in this room, you follow my directions. If you want to help by not scaring everyone so badly that they're afraid to tell the truth. Graham's jaw tightened, as if she'd pressed on a truth he didn't want to face, but he didn't brush it aside. He looked at her, then at the two beds, as if weighing something for the first time that couldn't be solved with violence or bought with money. Tessa turned back to the chart, but instead of leaving, she did something that even Lena Park would later call reckless. I'd like to review the summary of the accident and the initial emergency course, she said, steady, as if it were an ordinary clinical request. Graham looked at her, his eyes sharpening. What for? To understand why some signs don't match, Tessa replied. If I'm caring for them, I need to know the story their bodies have already lived through. Graham didn't speak, but Owen Pike appeared in the doorway like a shadow that always arrived on time. He handed over a thin, photocopied file without looking at Tessa for too long, simply setting it down. Tessa opened it and read fast, her eyes stopping on a few lines describing impact force, injury locations, the sequence of emergency interventions. Something was off. A small detail, but enough to turn her spine cold. The injury pattern didn't look like a single collision. It looked like a second force came after, like an extra shove when everything should have been over. She lifted her head and didn't speak right away, but her eyes had changed, like someone who'd just found a hidden door. Owen stood beside Graham, and for the first time his voice dropped to almost a whisper, not to be dramatic, but because he was afraid even the walls might have ears. That shouldn't be in the file. The moment Owen said that, the air in room 404 seemed to tighten another notch, and Tessa felt her heartbeat thud harder even while her face stayed calm. She wasn't the kind of person who liked digging into things that weren't her scope, but she also wasn't the kind who looked away when professional instinct spoke up. Tessa closed the file and set it down softly, as if she were afraid of disturbing something fragile, then looked at the two beds and reminded herself that, in here, first and foremost, there were still two human beings suspended between life and death. Not a case, not a power war. She left the room afterward, walking down the long corridor under faded fluorescent lights, with the smell of cleanser clinging to her hair, feeling as if the whole hospital were holding a secret and she'd just touched the edge of it. When the door to the nurse's station clicked shut behind her, Tessa leaned back against the medication cabinet, closed her eyes for one single beat, and an old memory rose up, not loud but sharp as a needle. Back then she'd still been a teenager, thin inside an oversized coat, huddled in the emergency department hallway where overhead pages, gurney wheels, and swallowed sobs braided together like a storm with no exit. Her little brother was in the room beyond, much smaller than she was, his face paper white, his lips cracked dry, his breathing so thin she had to count each rise and fall as if she might lose track. Tessa remembered her hands gripping the rail until her knuckles burned. She remembered her eyes locked on the door like a miracle would appear if she stared long enough. She remembered an administrative clerk handing her a stack of forms and speaking in a language that belonged to another world. Confirmation required, signatures required, insurance required, guardian information required, more time required. Tessa said she could sign, she could do anything. She just needed them to go in and look at him one more time. They told her to wait, and while she waited, time stretched into a cruelty with a shape. Her brother was still breathing, but with every passing minute his gaze drifted farther away, as if an invisible door called procedure were pushing him out of this world. No one hit him, no one did anything bloody, but delay can kill too, in the cleanest and coldest way. She remembered jolting to her feet when a doctor passed by and almost begging, "Please, he's still alive. Please don't leave him." The doctor looked at her with tired eyes, looked down at the chart, then said a sentence Tessa carried like a scar. "We're doing everything we can within what's possible." When she was finally allowed inside, her brother looked at her as if he wanted to apologize for not making it in time, and Tessa understood the most terrible thing of all. Sometimes someone gets written off while they're still breathing, not because they're dead, but because the system has decided they're going to die. The memory stopped there, clean and sharp, without extra words, because some pain, the more you name it, the more it steals your breath. Tessa opened her eyes, drew in a deep breath, straightened the name badge on her chest like she was straightening herself, then stepped back into the corridor with a goal so simple, it felt brutal. She wouldn't let anyone within her reach be treated like they'd vanished before they truly vanished. She returned to room 404 when the day was already leaning late, the light outside the window turning the color of lead, the monitor still beeping steadily as if it had never cared about human panic. Graham was still there, standing near the window, his reflection faint in the glass, broad shoulders locked tight like a man holding up the whole building by will alone. Tessa didn't look at him first. She went to Evelyn's bedside, set her hand on the rail, and her voice came out with a strange steadiness, as if everything she'd felt a moment ago had been compressed and stored for the exact right place. "Mrs. Evelyn, I'm back," she said. "I know you may be tired. I know you don't want anyone talking to you like you're a machine. I won't do that. I'm going to care for you as if you can hear, as if you're here, because you are here." She moved to Howard, her tone unchanged. "Mr. Howard, the same for you. I'll speak before I touch you each time. I'll tell you what's happening. I won't treat you like you've already left." Those words weren't an empty ritual. They were a vow. And in the corner of the room, Graham heard them, heard every word. And he couldn't laugh, couldn't sneer the way he usually did at anything he couldn't control, because the truth in her voice was too clean, too real, like a light that didn't allow darkness to hide. Tessa pulled out the small speaker and set it on the table beside the bed. She didn't turn on music. She only tapped the button lightly, starting a habit. She played a recording, not a song, not something loud, but a human voice reading slowly, evenly, threaded through with counted breaths. 1, 2, 3, then a pause, then again, like a rope lowered down to someone sinking. She checked the pulse while that voice filled the emptiness. A human rhythm in place of a machine's rhythm, because she'd learned it from someone who'd worked with coma patients, someone who'd taught her that sometimes what pulls a person back isn't medicine, it's the feeling that somebody stayed. Graham stared at the speaker like a secret being stripped bare in front of him. He took one step closer, and his voice wasn't purely cold anymore. There was a needlepoint of anger that had been pressed into pain. "Why do you care this much?" Tessa didn't turn right away. She stopped the recording at the moment it needed to stop, adjusted Evelyn's blanket, then finally looked straight at Graham, her eyes not defiant, only exposed. "A truth without decoration. Because someone once didn't," she said. "And I saw the price of that." Graham stood there a while after Tessa's answer, as if someone had placed a mirror in front of him that he couldn't smash. And the most frightening part wasn't what he saw, it was the fact that he could still feel. Tessa didn't force him to speak. She let the room speak for itself, with the steady beep and the stillness of two bodies on two beds. The kind of silence that either drives you mad or makes you admit what you've been running from. She simply worked the way she always did, checked the IV line, watched the monitor, adjusted the lamp angle, and then, when everything was steady, she turned to him and spoke softly, like an instruction, not a request. "If you want them to hear you, don't speak like you're giving an order," she said. "Speak like a son. A real memory. A detail only your mother would know. A smell, a sound, something she used to do for you when you were little." Graham's mouth twisted. His first reflex was to resist, because he was used to using anger to cover helplessness. "I've said enough," he replied. Tessa shook her head slightly. "You've spoken to the doctors, to the guards, to the whole city," she said. "But you haven't spoken to your mother." Graham looked like he was about to throw out a sneer, then swallowed it. Something in her voice made him unable to use his old weapons. He looked at Evelyn, at the face of the woman who had once been the center of a warm home, before the darkness in his life swallowed everything. He drew a breath, as if he were afraid his own breathing might crack the quiet, then stepped closer to the bed. His hand hesitated in midair, not sure where to touch, as if he'd forgotten how to touch someone he loved without hurting them. Tessa stood on the other side, not intruding, only there like a steady post, her eyes on Graham's hands instead of on his power. Graham bent down, his voice so small it almost got lost inside the machine sounds. "Mom," he called, and just those two words were enough to make his throat ache. He paused, then tried to dig up a memory that hadn't been stained by the night. He remembered a winter evening when he was a child, cold rain, thunder that startled him into tears, and his mother had pulled him into the kitchen, sat him on the counter, turned on a small flame, then made him a thin tea with a single drop of honey, telling him warmth would chase fear away, that steam would bring sleep. He told it, halting but real, and then he said one detail only they had ever shared. "You always squeezed my finger 3 times before I fell asleep, like a promise. 1, 2, 3, so I'd know you were still there." When Graham reached that part, the room seemed to stop breathing. Tessa watched Evelyn, her eyes taut, not daring to blink. And then it happened. So small a person could convince themselves it was imagination, but so clear it couldn't be denied. Evelyn's finger curled, just slightly, like a weak answer to the memory that had just been touched, as if her body remembered before her awareness could return. Graham froze, his eyes wide, a pure flash of panic cracking across him like a fissure in stone. He couldn't speak. No one could. Tessa stepped in, set 2 fingers on Evelyn's wrist, checked the monitor, then looked back at the finger that had moved, as if confirming it again so no one could steal the moment with doubt. She gave the smallest nod, telling Graham he wasn't crazy. But right then the door opened, and Dr. Sloane came back, called by the on-duty nurse because a value had shifted. He looked quickly, read the screen, checked the patient's position, then asked, "Kurt, what happened?" Graham spun around, like a man holding a spark in his hand and terrified it would be snuffed out. "My mother just moved," he said hoarsely, her finger. "Doctor." Sloane stepped closer, checked reflexes, pupils, the numbers, then let out a very light breath. the kind a person releases when they don't want to inflate hope they aren't sure they can hold. "It could be a reflex," he said in clinical tones, each word like a lid lowered onto a boiling pot. "Movements that small sometimes happen. It doesn't mean she's waking up." Tessa felt heat rise in her chest at that sentence. Not because he was cruel, but because she knew people sometimes have to say that to keep a family from shattering when hope doesn't come true. But Graham heard the word reflex like a denial. His fist tightened, his eyes darkened, and the room began to smell like a storm about to break. Tessa moved faster than the storm. She didn't argue with the doctor. She only said one line, just enough to keep the moment alive inside Graham without turning it into a cheap promise. "Reflex or not, it happened right when you spoke the memory," she said. "So we keep doing it that way, doctor." Sloane looked at her, didn't object, but didn't yield either, then turned away and gave instructions according to procedure. And just when people thought the tension might drop, the monitor suddenly flickered. The numbers dipped faster than a normal shift. The alarm didn't wail like a movie. It was only a short, sharp chirp, enough to make the listener's heart go cold. Graham lunged forward as if he could pull his mother back up with sheer force, and Dr. Sloane lifted a hand. But it was Tessa who cut through the panic with a steady voice. "Don't touch the lines," she told Graham. Not loud, but solid as a lock. She checked the tubing, checked sensor placement, adjusted the oxygen clip, watched the breathing, then called the on-duty nurse in for support. She spoke each step like a piece of music she'd rehearsed, doing and speaking at once, so everyone in the room could hold on to something concrete instead of falling into fear. "I'm adjusting the electrodes. I'm checking the pulse. I'm going to remeasure," she said. And within seconds, the readings climbed back into a stable range. The alarm went quiet as if it had never existed. The whole room released a late breath. Graham stood there, his hand trembling for a moment before he forced it still, his eyes locked on his mother, as if he feared that if he looked away, that finger movement would be erased from reality. Tessa documented it in the chart. No embellishment, only the exact time, the exact response, the exact fluctuation, because she knew things like this only mattered if they were written down. When everyone left, the room returned to the steady machine beep and the cold light. But out in the corridor, something else had happened too, that no one in the room knew yet. The security camera mounted on the ceiling, aimed straight at the door of room 404, suddenly lost its feed for exactly 1 minute. A clean blank gap like a cut made with a sharp blade. No shake, no static, no stutter. It simply vanished and then came back, as if an invisible hand had flipped it off and on at the exact moment it was needed. Owen Pike stood at the corner of the hall, staring at the report on his phone after internal security flagged it, his face unchanged but his eyes turning cold. When Graham stepped out to breathe, Owen moved closer and spoke very quietly, so only Graham could hear, as if he feared the whole hospital was listening in. That wasn't a technical glitch. Owen didn't explain anything else out in the corridor, because he understood that some secrets only need one word spoken out loud to land in the wrong ears. And in this hospital, there were always more ears than people thought. He motioned for Graham to follow him toward a shadowed corner near the fire exit, where the hum of the ventilation was louder than any whisper. On Owen's phone screen, the hallway camera footage replayed like a cold river. The door to room 404 sat in the middle of the frame like a silent mouth, and then suddenly, at the exact moment Evelyn moved, the entire image went black. No static, no shake, no flicker. It didn't drop. It shut off. 1 minute later, the picture returned, clean, as if there had never been a gap. Owen zoomed in on the timestamp and pointed to the number. "Exactly 60 seconds, he said softly. "Not a signal loss. This is a cut." Graham stared at it. His face didn't change, but his eyes darkened, as if he'd just heard a declaration of war from a place he'd never expected. "The hospital," he repeated, low. Owen nodded. If it was a technical issue, it wouldn't be that clean, and it wouldn't choose that exact minute. Graham stood still, his hand gripping the stair rail until his knuckles blanched. For 6 months, he'd believed his enemies played their games on the street, in warehouses, at dark intersections, places where he knew the rules. But if someone was bold enough to put a hand inside the hospital itself, right in this corridor, right outside his parents' door, then this wasn't ordinary intimidation anymore. This was something else, colder, smarter, and more dangerous because it wore a legal face. He turned his head toward room 404, as if looking could push the darkness back. Inside, Tessa was still documenting, her handwriting straight and spare. No embellishment, no exclamation. She didn't know anything about the cut video, but she felt the air had changed, because Graham walked in with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of helplessness now, but the silence of a man who'd just found a footprint. He came to the table and placed a sheet of paper in front of Tessa. Not a medical form, but an internal transfer request. Her name already written in. "I'm moving you to another unit," Graham said. Not loud, but every syllable was an order wrapped in a reason. "It isn't safe here." Tessa looked up. Her eyes weren't afraid, but there was a needle-sharp caution in them, because she'd lived in houses where the word safe was always used to justify locking someone in. "Where are you moving me?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Graham looked at her, as if weighing whether to tell the truth. He wasn't used to explaining. He was used to doing. "I can arrange it," he said. "Somewhere no one can reach you." For anyone else, that might have sounded like protection. To Tessa, it sounded like possession. She set her pen down and didn't sign. She didn't argue, either. She stood, picked up her chart, and walked straight to the door, passing Graham as if he were only a large shadow, untouched. He thought she was leaving. She wasn't. She didn't leave the VIP unit. She turned into the nurse's desk, opened a computer, logged into the system, and started writing an incident report exactly by hospital procedure, line by line, time, symptoms, interventions, vital sign changes. Everything specific and objective, no labels, no accusations. She selected the category connected to security, because she knew what had happened wasn't only medical, and most important, she submitted it through the official system where it would carry a timestamp and couldn't disappear just because someone said the right sentence. Graham stood behind her, watching the screen, understanding what she was doing. She wasn't refusing him with words. She was refusing him with action. She wasn't letting him move her like a chess piece. She was planting herself in paperwork. When she hit submit, the system flashed a confirmation message, and Tessa let out a slow breath, like she'd just tied a rope around a truth so it couldn't be swept away. Owen appeared on the other side of the desk, his eyes flicking over the report, then back to Tessa with a new kind of assessment. Not many people dared to do that when they were facing Graham Kessler. Tessa turned and looked at Graham. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly, low enough that no one else could hear, but clear enough that he would. "If something is wrong here, I'm going to leave a trail." Graham looked at her like she was a wall that had just been built in front of his power. He hated walls, but he also understood their value in this moment. Owen pulled Tessa slightly aside and spoke in short, careful words. "Have you seen the camera outside room 404? Tessa frowned. She hadn't. Owen opened a piece of data. Not the full video, but the access log with timestamps. Lines of cold text colder than any image. Tessa looked, her eyes moving fast, then stopping, as if a hook had caught in her mind. In the exact minute the camera feed was cut, the log recorded a badge swipe near the room door. If the video was cut, then whoever swiped the badge disappeared from the frame. Tessa leaned closer, reading the badge type. Not a nursing badge, not a physician badge. It was an administrative badge, the kind issued to management and oversight. People who didn't need to enter patient areas at night unless they had a reason they didn't want anyone to know. A chill crawled up the back of Tessa's neck, not because she feared darkness, but because she feared darkness that knew how to wear bright clothes. She lifted her head, about to say it, when Lena Park appeared suddenly, her face drained of color. Lena pulled Tessa into the shadow behind the desk, her hand shaking, as if one look from the wrong person would make everything collapse. "What are you doing?" Lena whispered, nearly panicked. "You filed a security incident tied to room 404. Do you have any idea what you just touched?" Tessa kept her voice steady. "I only followed procedure." Lena shook her head over and over, her eyes reddening with fear. "There are people here who don't want procedure," she said, her voice thick. "If you push this up, they won't be able to touch Mr. Kessler the way they want, but they can touch you. They'll get you fired. They'll take your license." And then Lena dropped her voice even more, like she was speaking a curse. "If you keep bringing this up, they'll end your career." Lena Park's warning didn't make Tessa step back, but it dropped a cold stone into her stomach, heavy and hard to swallow, because she understood exactly how a system can grind down an unknown person without ever getting its hands dirty. She went back to room 404 with twice the caution. Not fear, but discipline. like someone walking on thin ice who has to keep her breathing perfectly even. Graham was still there, quieter than before, but his silence now wasn't pure helplessness. It was anger locked in a cage, ready to bite anything that came too close. Owen had disappeared into the corridor with his phone, as if he were following an invisible thread. Tessa continued caring for Evelyn and Howard by the book. No extra flourishes, no long stretches of audio, nothing that would give anyone a reason to say she'd stepped outside her scope, but she didn't abandon her habit of speaking to the patients, because it was the only thing she believed was right. She knew she was being watched, and the most terrifying truth was that she didn't know whose eyes they were. The next morning, when she stepped into the staff area to take handoff, the air had changed. A small group of people in business attire stood by the nurse's desk. They weren't doctors. They weren't nurses. They were the kind of people who carried pristine folders and expensive perfume, the kind who only showed up when a hospital was trying to protect itself. A woman in her 40s, hair pinned into a tight bun, an ID badge identifying her as board liaison, was speaking to Lena in a polite voice with no room for disagreement. "We're conducting a review of the care plan for room 404, she said. "There's a report concerning unapproved stimulation methods." Tessa heard her name spoken, not like a question, but like a red mark that had already been drawn on the file. She stepped forward and kept her shoulders straight. "I'm Tessa Halbrook, the night shift nurse assigned to room 404, she said. The woman looked her up and down as if reading a checklist of violations, then held out a sheet of paper. "You're under review," she said evenly. "There's a complaint that you used stimulation methods outside the approved protocol, including playing audio and verbal interaction without indication. While this review is ongoing, you're not permitted to perform any interventions beyond standard procedure without explicit authorization." Tessa felt blood rush into her ears. In 1 second, she saw the trap clearly. They weren't attacking Graham Kessler directly because they feared the consequences. They were attacking the easiest person in that room to crush, the person with a license, a record, something to lose, and most important, someone who could be labeled as doing something wrong. A soft hit, clean, and effective. The fake-out was that everything was wrapped in patient safety language, in words like safety, protocol, responsibility. But Tessa looked into the woman's eyes and saw the real thing. The hospital was protecting the hospital, not Evelyn, not Howard, not the truth. Lena stood beside her, her face pulled tight like a wire, too afraid to speak on Tessa's behalf. Tessa kept her voice steady. "I followed procedure," she said. "I documented everything in the chart. I used nothing harmful. The audio I used was spoken reading, not medical equipment, not medication, and the purpose was to create a stable environment." The woman didn't argue. She only nodded as if every word Tessa said would be filed into a drawer that would never be opened. "You can submit a written statement," she said, "and you may be called before a disciplinary board if violations are found." Tessa heard disciplinary board the way you hear a lock turning. She wasn't afraid of being scolded. She was afraid of losing the only thing she'd built with blood and nights, the career she clung to like a plank in a river's pull. But what hurt more was the feeling that she was being turned into a sacrifice to seal a hole someone else had made. She turned away, walked straight to a computer, opened the record, and rechecked every note, as if adding one more line could keep her standing. Owen appeared a moment later, his eyes colder than usual. He didn't speak to Tessa right away. He pulled Graham aside, and Tessa only saw Graham gripping the strap of Owen's jacket as if he were grabbing for an answer. A minute later, Owen came back. His face didn't change, but his voice dropped low and firm. "Do you know Quincy Hale?" Tessa frowned. She'd heard the name in passing, in a few staff whispers, the kind of name people said softly, like they were afraid it might be overheard. Owen looked at her and continued, placing the information into her hands like a stone so she could feel its weight. "This system moved because of one phone call. I confirmed someone on the oversight board is related to Hale. A cousin. That person has administrative-level security access, and enough influence to trigger a surprise review right after you filed that report." Tessa's throat went dry, so that 1-minute cut wasn't only a trace. It was a reminder that someone was sitting high above, and with one pen stroke could rewrite another person's life. She looked toward room 404, where Evelyn and Howard still lay motionless, innocent and still, two perfect vulnerabilities in a war that was never fair. Graham stepped closer to Tessa, his eyes dark as water before a storm, but this time his voice wasn't a command. It was almost a question, and that was what startled her most. "Tell me what you need," Graham said, as if he were willing to tear the whole building down if that was what it took, as long as he could save the person in front of him and the people behind that door. Tessa didn't look away. She understood he was standing on a line. One side was the way he'd always lived. The other side was what she'd just forced him to learn. Do it right, do it clean, so the truth could exist. She didn't ask him for power. She asked him for the kind of power that lived in paper and ink. "I need the truth," she said, each word clear as a stamped seal. On paper, Tessa's sentence hung in the air like a blank sheet waiting for a signature, and Graham held her gaze for a long moment, as if for the first time he understood there were things he couldn't take with a fist and couldn't buy with a credit card. He gave a slight nod, no long promise, then turned to Owen and signaled with a look. Owen understood. In their world, one look could set an entire chain of people and actions in motion. But this time, the goal wasn't to threaten anyone, it was to find a clean trace. Exactly what Tessa had asked for. Tessa went back into room 404 and worked with absolute care, documenting more tightly, still speaking to the patients, but choosing shorter words, leaving no opening for anyone to label her as emotional. She felt like she was walking a wire, a drop beneath her, a system above her ready to cut the rope and call it an accident. As she placed her hand on Evelyn's bed rail to check her, the door opened again. This time it wasn't a doctor, and it wasn't the head nurse. It was a small group carrying the cold air of law. At the front was a woman in a dark coat, hair cut neat, eyes sharp as a blade without any show. Beside her were two men with badges and thick envelopes in their hands. The woman entered like someone used to walking straight into places other people didn't want to open. "Hello, Mr. Kessler," she said calmly. "I'm Rebecca Hart, Assistant District Attorney. I have an order requesting records and a few questions that need clarification related to room 404. Tessa felt the room contract. Lena Park hovered at the doorway, her face paper white, like she'd known this was coming sooner or later. Graham turned. His eyes were dark, and for 1 second Tessa thought he'd do what everyone always said he would do, turn the room into a place where no one dared to breathe. But he didn't. He looked first at the two beds, at his mother and father unmoving under the blankets, and something in him seemed to be pulled back, as if an invisible hand had caught his wrist at the last second. He didn't want his parents, even in coma, to become unwilling spectators to a display of power. He didn't want this room, a room of fragile life and unsaid promises, turned into a stage. He drew a breath and asked one question, his voice cold but not explosive. "What are you here for?" Rebecca Hart didn't flinch. She opened the envelope, drew out the paperwork, handed it to Owen to review, then looked straight at Graham. "There's a complaint," she said. "A complaint that medical staff assigned to room 404 are being pressured to perform unapproved interventions, and that there are signs of care records being altered. I'm here to verify that." She paused, her gaze sliding over Tessa the way it slid over a name on a report. "And I'm also here to confirm this nurse isn't being coerced by you or your people." The fake-out was that Tessa had expected everyone to look at Graham and see violence, the underworld, the rumors. But Rebecca Hart aimed for the cleanest thing in the room: paper, records, protocol. And Quincy Hale's trap came into sharper focus. They didn't need Graham to bleed. They only needed to push him into a situation where he'd react wrong, then turn that reaction into evidence. Graham didn't answer with threats. He looked at Rebecca Hart for a long beat, then looked to Owen like an order for silence. Then he turned to Tessa, his voice dropping. No longer power, but a pact made in daylight. "Speak," he said. "Tell the truth." Tessa understood this was the moment that would decide whether she'd be turned into a pawn or into a witness. She stepped forward and kept her distance from Rebecca Hart. Didn't act familiar with Graham. Didn't stand with him emotionally. Only stood with the truth through data. "I'm not being coerced," Tessa said. "Clear. I followed procedure. I documented everything in the system. I filed an incident report when there was a vital sign fluctuation, and when I noticed an abnormal security issue in the hallway." Rebecca Hart lifted an eyebrow. "An abnormal issue." Tessa nodded. The hallway camera outside, room 404, lost its feed for exactly 1 minute. At the same time, the patient showed a movement response. "I don't have authority to access the video, but I filed the report and requested security review." Rebecca Hart looked at Lena Park. "I want a copy of that report and the complete related logs," she said. Lena swallowed hard and nodded like a machine. Rebecca Hart turned back to Graham, her eyes still sharp. but her question shifted its weight. "So you're not the one who filed the complaint?" Graham gave her a thin flash of sarcasm. "You think I went and reported myself?" Rebecca Hart didn't react to the tone. "I don't know what you do," she said. "I only know someone wanted me here today, at this exact time." That sentence made Owen tilt his head slightly, like a man hearing an offbeat in music. Tessa felt it too. The complaint arrived right after the minute the camera was cut, right after she'd been put under review, right after Hale started moving. It was too neat. It looked like a trap designed to bring the law to the doorway of room 404, to pull every eye into this place, and to force Graham to choose between the way he'd always chosen and the way he'd never chosen. Rebecca Hart opened another folder, scanned it quickly, then continued like she was stamping a seal. "I'm not here because someone told me you're violent, Mr. Kessler. I'm here because there are indicators of interference with medical care and data alteration. If that's true, this stops being a hospital matter. It becomes criminal." Graham didn't move. Tessa watched him, waiting for the storm to break. But he only looked back at his parents, then placed his hand on Evelyn's bed rail, so lightly it was almost not a touch. In that moment, Tessa saw his choice clearly. He wouldn't make a scene. Not here. Not in front of them. Rebecca Hart followed the gesture with her eyes. They didn't soften, but she registered it. She turned back to Tessa, her voice lowering, like a warning not meant for an audience. "Miss Halbrook," she said, "I'm going to review every record. I'm going to speak with the hospital, but I'm making one thing very clear. If I see any sign that Mr. Kessler or his people pressured you, even once, you'll become a key witness in a major case, and he'll have no way back." She paused, looking straight at Graham. "And the same goes for you. If I see one sign of coercion aimed at this nurse, you're done." After Rebecca Hart left the VIP unit, the hallway felt emptier, but it didn't feel lighter. It felt like a room that had just been sealed with one more lock. Tessa could feel every gaze around her change color. They weren't looking at her like a night shift nurse anymore. They were looking at her like a risk hanging over the unit. She finished her documentation with an almost obsessive care, printed copies according to protocol, saved the confirmation code, and told herself that if the system wanted to crush her, she'd leave a trail long enough for someone to still find the truth. But the truth didn't stay inside the hospital. It followed her all the way to the parking lot, into the cold wind cutting between rows of yellow lights, and into the buzz of her phone the moment she set her bag on the passenger seat. A legal envelope had been tucked under her windshield wiper, the paper inside shockingly cold against her fingers. Tessa opened it under the dome light, her eyes skimming the dense lines, then stopping on the phrase that dried her throat out. Wage garnishment notice, income withholding order, the amount demanded, the effective date, all of it written in the language people use to turn a life into a number due. She'd taken collection calls before. She'd lived with bills that chased her like a shadow. But this was different. This wasn't a threat. This was an official strike. And it arrived at the exact moment she was under review. The exact moment a nurse only needed one scratch on her record to be pushed out of the profession, while the world kept walking. Tessa sat motionless in the car for several minutes, her fist tightening around the paper until it wrinkled, her mind sprinting through worst-case scenes, losing her job, losing her license, losing the ability to pay rent, and worse, losing the only thing she'd built out of ash. A dry laugh escaped her, not happy, not even painful, just helpless. Right now, she opened her banking app, stared at the balance, then looked back at the envelope. If they withheld her pay, she wouldn't make it through next month. She leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes, and the thought of quitting slid in like a warm snake, sweet and poisonous. Resign. Leave the VIP unit. Retreat before they stripped her license. Get away from room 404 before everything turned into a scandal and she got dragged down with it. The thought sounded reasonable in a terrifying way. She'd even opened her phone to draft a message asking to step off the assignment, her finger hovering over the screen, her heart pounding the way it had pounded in that hallway years ago when she couldn't save her little brother. And that was the moment she stopped. Not from pride, not from courage, but because one small image rose up so sharp it hurt. The emergency room door closing, the cold fluorescent light, a child breathing thinner and thinner while adults kept saying wait. Tessa swallowed hard. If she walked away from room 404 out of fear, she'd repeat that story, only changing the name of the person in the bed. She started the car, drove in a wide loop, then turned back into the lot. as if even the wheels had to learn how to choose a road. Tessa returned to the hospital before her next shift. Not like a winner, but like someone stepping into fire, because there was no other choice she could live with. She carried the legal envelope in her bag like a stone. Before she entered room 404, she stopped in the staff room, opened the envelope again under brighter light, and read every line slowly, searching for a seam. And then she saw it. A small detail the entire debt system might not have expected her to notice. The attached original contract carried her signature, the name Tessa Halbrook written in the clumsy hand of youth. But the signing date clearly showed a year when she wasn't yet 18. She went still. A financial contract signed when she was underage couldn't carry the force they were using to garnish her wages. Cold ran down her spine. Not fear cold, recognition cold. This wasn't only a debt, this was a trap. A trap as clean as the paper in a hospital, and it arrived at the exact moment she was being targeted in room 404. Tessa put the envelope away and went into the room, working as she always did, greeting Evelyn, greeting Howard, checking numbers, adjusting pillows, speaking before each touch, but inside her head the pieces began to lock together. Someone who could cut a hallway camera for 1 minute, someone who could trigger a board review, could also make a legal envelope appear on the exact day she was weakest. When she returned to the table to document, Graham was standing by the window. He watched her longer than usual, as if he sensed something new in the set of her shoulders, a heavier weight. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Tessa hadn't planned to tell him, but she also knew hiding it would only make her easier to crush. She handed him the envelope and let him see the first page without offering a long explanation. "They're garnishing my wages," she said, "for a debt I don't actually owe, and I'm under review here." Graham read it. His eyes darkened, the dark of a man who immediately sees the fastest way to put out a fire. He said one short word, "Cold." "I'll handle it." Tessa looked at him and, in a single heartbeat, she saw the road he meant to take. A call, an intermediary, a meeting no one documented, silence purchased with fear. She placed her hand on the table, kept her voice firm as a door held against a kick. "No," she said. "If you touch anyone the way you do, I'm leaving. Immediately." Graham narrowed his eyes, as if he couldn't believe anyone would place conditions on him while he was trying to protect them. Tessa didn't budge. "If you keep it clean, I'll stay," she said, each word precise. "I need a lawyer. I need paperwork. I need everything done by the book, the same way I'm doing it in this room. If you turn it into a dirty fight, all they'll have to do is point at me and say I'm complicit, and I'll lose everything." She met his stare without pleading. "I can't lose this career." Graham stood there for a long time, as if he were standing between two selves. One was the way he'd survived. One was what he'd just learned in room 404, that some people can't be saved by darkness. Finally, he nodded. Not a reluctant nod meant to end the conversation, but a nod that felt like signing something he'd never signed before. "Fine," he said. "We'll do it your way." Graham's nod didn't make anything lighter. It only gave room 404 something it had never held before. A silent agreement that from now on, truth would be protected by paperwork, not by fear. Owen began making calls the legitimate way. Real attorneys, real process, no shortcuts, no threats. Tessa was still under review, still ordered to stay tight to protocol, but she knew she'd created a trail that was hard to erase, and that let her breathe, just a little. As evening fell, Chicago itself seemed to change color. The sky dimmed faster than usual, wind punching through the seams of glass as if someone were trying to tilt the city. Storm warnings scrolled across hallway screens, lines of text about high winds, lightning, and the risk of localized power outages. The hospital tightened procedure like a ship preparing to cross rough water, limiting access, checking badges harder, sending techs to inspect backup generators, rolling crash carts closer to their stations. The VIP unit had always been quiet. Now it felt like a sealed compartment, where every footstep echoed like a knock against a hull. Tessa came on for the night shift with a small bag. The little speaker sat inside it like a secret she'd carried since the first day. But tonight she felt it was time to tell the truth. Not because she needed to be understood, because she knew tonight would be hard, and if everything started to shake, people would need an anchor. Graham was already in the room. No outer coat, only a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up, like a man who'd decided he wasn't leaving even if the whole city went under. He turned when Tessa set her things on the table. His eyes flicked to the speaker again. This time, it wasn't pure suspicion. It was a question he'd been holding back for days. Tessa opened her bag, took out the speaker, set it in its familiar place, then looked at Evelyn for a beat, as if asking permission from the woman lying still. "Mrs. Evelyn, I'd like to try something tonight," she said softly. "You might like it." Graham frowned. "What did you find?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She pulled out her phone and opened an audio file, her finger hovering over the play button like she was standing in front of a door into memory. "I told you I didn't steal anything," she said, steady, "and I meant it." She looked at Graham, then said a sentence that made him go still. "I know your mother's voice." Graham stiffened. He was about to ask how, but Tessa pressed play first, as if she understood that sometimes you have to let the truth walk in on its own. At first there was only a soft hiss, the sound of a microphone in a hall. Then a woman's voice rose, warm, clear, rhythmic, not the flat tone of a device and not the voice of a nurse. It was Evelyn's voice, younger, stronger, caught in a moment of her life the hospital hadn't yet swallowed. The voice was reading a children's story, slowly, with the right pauses and gentle emphasis. The way you read to a child who's afraid of the dark. Tessa hadn't chosen it for performance. She'd chosen it because it was a rope from the past to the present, and that rope belonged to Evelyn herself. Graham stood like he'd turned to stone. His eyes widened, then softened shut just a fraction, as if he feared that if he stared too hard, the memory would dissolve. The reading continued. There was a small laugh from an audience, the faint shuffle of turning pages, the atmosphere of a fundraiser, a world far away from room 404. Tessa lowered the volume just enough so it didn't drown out the monitor, letting the voice slip in like warmth. Graham finally turned to Tessa, his voice no longer sharp. "Where did you get this?" Tessa drew a breath. "Years ago," she said. "I was in a reading program for kids in foster care. Every month, someone sponsored books and activities. We didn't know who they were. We only saw names on a plaque in the little library." Tessa paused, then spoke the name like she was saying an ordinary miracle. "Evelyn Kessler." The words landed like something soft but heavy, and the room went very still, leaving only the machine sounds and Evelyn's voice from the speaker. Tessa looked at Evelyn on the bed, then back at Graham. "I didn't know she was your mother until I saw the name in the chart," she said. "I didn't know she'd done fundraiser readings either until I found the program page again. This clip is public, an old video. I downloaded it because I thought, if she can still hear, maybe she'll recognize herself." She didn't add how many pages she'd had to search, how many nights she'd sat alone in a small apartment listening to that voice again and again until she was sure, because she didn't want this to become a story about credit. She only wanted the truth to stand there, simple as it was. Graham turned his face slightly away, as if something had stung his eyes. For years, he'd believed he was the only one carrying the family, the only one doing anything, the only one standing between the world and the people he loved. But it turned out his mother had touched another life long ago, quietly, without needing anyone to know, without needing applause. And the young woman standing in this room, the one he'd once assumed he could buy with money or move with power, had once been helped by his mother in the simplest way, giving a child a book, letting a child hear an adult read in a warm voice. That realization made Graham feel smaller in a way that was both painful and clean. He looked at Evelyn, then bent down and laid his hand lightly over the back of his mother's hand, this time with less hesitation. "Mom," he whispered, as if speaking to the whole past. "I didn't know." Tessa stepped back and let the moment belong to them, but she kept the speaker playing, the reading continuing like a lamp that refused to go out. Outside the window, dark clouds thickened. Wind struck the glass, and the first heavy rain began to hit in bursts like knuckles knocking. In the corridor, the intercom announced preparations for severe weather, reminding staff to check backup power. The VIP unit truly felt like a sealed ship, trembling slightly with each gust. And then, as if the storm chose the perfect moment to prove its authority, lightning tore across the sky. White light flashed through the window. Thunder cracked so hard the whole building seemed to shudder. The room lights flickered once, then again. Darkness dropped for a brief beat, then was dragged back up. The monitor immediately chirped a short warning, and the rhythm on the screen stuttered like a heart weighing its choices, as if even life had to pause and decide whether it would keep going. The moment the monitor's warning sound cut off, the ceiling lights flickered once more, and then went out completely, as if someone had blown them out with a breath. The entire room dropped into a darkness so thick Tessa could hear her own blood moving in her ears. Immediately, the backup system kicked in with a low hum. Faint emergency strips lit along the baseboards, enough to see the path but not enough to hide the sense that the whole building was swaying. Out in the corridor came a rush of footsteps, clipped calls between staff, wheels of carts rolling fast over the floor, and the distant, repeated chirps of devices like a tense orchestra falling out of rhythm. The VIP unit, already sealed like a ship's compartment, now felt like a vessel being pulled toward a whirlpool. But inside room 404, Tessa didn't allow herself to panic. She'd seen too many moments where people died not because their bodies failed first, but because everyone around them fell apart. She moved at once, her hands steady, her voice low and clear like a rope pulling everyone back into reality. "Backup power is running," she said, not to soothe, but to name the situation. She checked the screen, the airway line, the tubing, the electrodes. She hit the call button and triggered the internal emergency code, stating the exact location. Room 404, VIP. She pulled the small crash cart closer, already staged for storm protocol. Popped a drawer. Did a fast check. Monitor battery backup. Power connection. Secured. Graham stood beside the bed like he'd been nailed there, his eyes sweeping from the screen to his mother, then to his father, as if he'd been forced to face something he couldn't buy. The emergency light sharpened the angles of his face and darkened his eyes. He opened his mouth as if to summon someone the old way, but Tessa didn't give him the chance to turn the room into a theater of power. She snapped her head toward him, her voice not loud, but cutting clean through everything. "Mr. Kessler, look at me." Graham froze, as if he'd been struck by a sentence. Tessa pointed to Howard's hand, then to the chair beside the bed. "You hold his hand, right now, and you talk. Don't stop." Graham stared at her, resistance flaring by instinct. "I'm not a nurse." Tessa shook her head, her eyes not soft. "I don't need you to be a nurse. I need you to be an anchor." She laid her fingers on Evelyn's wrist, felt the rhythm, watched the monitor. "You can command a whole city, but you can't command this heart. The only thing you can do is stay." That landed where Graham had no armor. He sat down. His hand closed around Howard's, this time without hesitation. It was cold. He squeezed gently, afraid that if he held too hard, he'd break something fragile. Tessa kept moving, rechecked the airway, adjusted the electrodes, watched the numbers pitch and dip like a ship taking waves. Another nurse rushed in, eyes wide, asking what she needed. Tessa answered in short bursts. The exact items: backup battery, confirm power feed, call the on-duty physician. Outside, thunder struck again. The window glass shuddered, and in the thin emergency light, Evelyn's recorded voice still flowed from the speaker, like a candle battered by wind but not yet extinguished. Graham lifted his head, as if he'd suddenly remembered whose voice that was. He looked at Evelyn. His lips trembled, and then he began to speak, not like a man in control, but like a son who hadn't dared to call his mother for a long time. "Mom," he whispered, and his voice broke a little on the first sound. "I'm here. I can hear you. I remember that day, when I was little, when the rain was so hard, and you made me sit on the kitchen counter and told me to watch the steam rise from the tea. You said fear was just cold that got lost, and warmth would find its way back." He swallowed hard. His eyes reddened in the weak light, and for the first time in years, he let out what he'd been hiding. "I'm sorry," he said, rough. "I turned myself into the person I thought I had to be. I did things I thought would protect you, but I only pushed you farther away. I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared I can't pull you back. I'm scared I'm too late." Tessa heard the word scared, and it felt like someone had opened a window in an airless room. This wasn't performance. This was truth. And at the exact moment Graham's voice stopped trying to stay cold, at the exact moment it steadied into something human, the monitor began to steady too in a way that felt almost wrong, as if Evelyn's body were holding onto the rhythm of a familiar voice, as if life itself needed something to grip. Tessa didn't say the connection out loud, but she saw it. She saw the waveform smooth, saw the numbers stop jumping. She made one more adjustment, checked again, then looked at Graham and signaled with her eyes that he must not stop. Graham continued, his voice now a tether pulled from his chest to his mother's hand. "Do you remember how you squeezed my finger 3 times? He whispered. 1, 2, 3, like a promise you were always there. I'm squeezing back now. 1, 2, 3. When he reached that part, the air seemed to congeal. Tessa felt her fingers go numb with tension, and then something happened that couldn't be mistaken. Not like the earlier finger curl that someone could call a reflex. Evelyn's eyelids fluttered, then opened to a narrow slit. Her gaze didn't drift up to the ceiling. It searched, slowly but with direction, like someone swimming up from deep water and fixing on the light. Then it stopped, locked onto Graham's face. Not random, not empty. It was recognition. A moment where someone on the inside spoke to the outside and said, "I hear you." Graham stopped breathing. His eyes went wide. His mouth opened as if to call her name, but no sound came. Tessa leaned in, checked pupils, checked breathing, felt the shift the way you feel permission for a miracle to exist. Evelyn held Graham's gaze for one more beat. Then her lids grew heavy and closed again, like a door that opened just long enough to prove it was still there, then shut because it didn't have the strength to stay open. But the trace was undeniable. No one in the room could pretend otherwise. More footsteps rushed in. Doctor Sloane appeared, coat flaring slightly with his speed, his eyes sweeping equipment. Then Tessa, then Graham, gripping his mother's hand like he was holding his whole life. He looked at the monitor, looked at Evelyn again, then looked at Graham with a new seriousness, like a physician being forced to acknowledge something science doesn't like to name before there's enough evidence. He stepped closer, did a quick exam, then straightened, his voice low but firm. No longer the earlier reflex line meant to cool hope. That was purposeful. After that storm night, the hospital felt like it was crawling out of a shared nightmare. The corridor lights held steady again. Procedures were reviewed. Internal meetings stacked up back to back, and the VIP unit was tightened even more, as if someone was afraid that one small gap would be enough for the truth to spill out. But inside room 404, what had shifted couldn't be pushed back into place. Tessa kept working under the prying gaze of oversight, under questions stamped with suspicion, under the shadow of an investigation. She was ordered to document more detail, warned not to play audio without approval, required to have a witness present for anything outside standard touch and check tasks. But she stayed. She kept speaking to Evelyn and Howard in a human voice. She kept touching them as if their lives still carried dignity. Graham stayed too. He spoke less, but he didn't leave. In the days after the storm, he seemed strange inside his own room, like a man who had seen himself exposed and could no longer pretend he hadn't. Dr. Sloane didn't call that moment a miracle. He called it purposeful response and ordered close monitoring, gradual adjustments to the care plan, and waiting. Waiting is what drains people the most, because it gives you nothing to hit. Then came the third day after the storm. As Tessa checked pupils and breathing, Evelyn opened her eyes for longer. Not a brief slit and gone, but long enough for her gaze to hold the room and understand where she was. She looked at the ceiling, the lights, then turned as if searching for something familiar. Graham stood close to the bed, shoulders rigid, as if one hard breath would shatter the moment. Evelyn saw him, and her gaze stopped, not drifting, not floating away. She couldn't speak yet. Her throat was dry. Her lips moved like a door stuck on a hinge. But in her eyes was a word that didn't need sound. "My son." Graham bent down, both hands closing around hers, as if he was afraid she'd slip out of the world again. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, but he forced it quiet. I'm here. Evelyn blinked slowly, then tried to curl her fingers. This time it wasn't reflex. She squeezed his hand, weak but intentional. Graham stared at that hand like it was a pardon. Tessa stood nearby and kept her clinical calm, but her chest tightened with feeling, because she knew a small squeeze can pull someone back from the edge. She stepped in to adjust Evelyn's pillow, spoke softly through each step the way she always did, then placed her fingers on Evelyn's wrist to check. Evelyn looked at Tessa. Her gaze softened in a different way than it did for Graham. She didn't know who Tessa was in her life before, but her body recognized gentleness. Evelyn shifted slightly and reached for Tessa's hand. Her fingers touched Tessa's, then squeezed, just a little, like a thank you she couldn't say yet. Tessa went still for a beat, feeling as if every cold night she'd endured, every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd nearly quit, had been repaid in that single squeeze. Graham saw it, and that was when he couldn't keep the cold mask on. He turned his face away, but the tears still slid down, silent, like something he'd forbidden himself for a long time. He didn't cry like a weak man. He He cried like a man who had just survived himself, shame mixed with relief, because he knew he'd done too many cruel things, and yet he was being handed a clean chance to start over. Tessa let him cry. She didn't stare. She didn't offer hollow comfort. She just kept caring and documenting by the book, the best way she knew to honor the moment. Over the next few hours, Evelyn woke and tired, opened her eyes and closed them again, but each time she opened them, she looked for Graham. Doctor. Sloane called it clear progress, and room 404 seemed able to breathe a little more. For a moment, the story almost seemed to turn fully toward healing, as if the storm had passed and only sunlight remained. And that was exactly when the trap changed direction. That afternoon, when Tessa stepped out to retrieve medication and paperwork, 2 internal hospital security staff stopped her in the hallway. They weren't rough. They weren't loud. They were simply cold enough to turn her into a detained person without a single cuff. A man in a suit, his badge marked Risk Management, approached with a thick envelope. "Miss Halbrook," he said, politely, without feeling, "by decision of the Oversight Board, you are placed on temporary suspension pending investigation of the Storm Night incident, with allegations of negligent practice and use of unapproved stimulation methods, creating risk to the patient." Tessa felt the world tilt. That Storm Night, when she'd kept room 404 functioning, when she'd called for help, when she'd done everything right, had just been turned into evidence against her. It was the perfect bait and switch. Give her one moment of hope, then rip the floor away. She opened the envelope. Her eyes ran through the lines, then stopped at the bottom of the page, where the approving signature sat. A name that wasn't a doctor and wasn't a nurse, but a senior administrator. And beside it, an administrative badge code was noted. The same type Tessa had seen in the log, the same kind that could show up in the minute the camera was cut. She lifted her head. Her throat was dry, but she made her voice hold. "I have the right to meet with my union representative and an attorney," she said. The man nodded, as if it was already written into the script. "You will," he replied, "but for now, you must leave the patient care area." Tessa turned her head toward room 404. The door was shut. Inside, Evelyn had just awakened again. Graham had just cried, and life was pushing up like a sprout through ash. Tessa wanted to run back in, to say she wasn't abandoning them, to say she wasn't leaving because she was small. But security had closed in on both sides like walls. Lena Park appeared at the far end of the hall, eyes red, lips trembling, but she didn't dare come closer, because she could feel the system's hand around the throat of the whole unit. Tessa drew a deep breath, swallowed the knot in her chest, and walked between the 2 security guards like she was walking through a trial without a judge. As she was escorted out of the VIP unit, the monitor sounds behind her continued steady, but to Tessa they suddenly felt far away, like a song being cut off in the middle. The VIP door closed behind her, and room 404, for the first time in many nights, fell into real silence. The moment the VIP door closed behind Tessa, inside room 404, Graham stood like the air had been pulled out of him, his eyes locked on the door, as if staring long enough could force it to open and rewind everything back to the way it had been. Evelyn had just stayed awake longer, had just squeezed his hand, had just looked at him like a real son, and in that exact moment, they took away the only person who had kept hope alive in this room. Graham's anger flared fast and hot, like gasoline catching fire. He spun toward Owen, his voice so low it turned dangerous. "Bring them here. All of them. Right now." Owen didn't blink, but this time he didn't obey. He stepped closer, dropped his voice, and repeated what Tessa had forced Graham to learn simply by existing. "If you do it the old way, they win," Owen said. "They're waiting for you to explode. They want you to tear the hospital apart, threaten people, do something big enough to give Rebecca Hart a reason to lock you away for good, and turn the story about that nurse into a stain that can't be washed out." Graham's jaw clenched. His eyes were red. He didn't know if it was anger or something else. He moved to Evelyn's bedside, looked at his mother, looked into the eyes that had just recognized him, and saw in that gaze a wordless warning. Don't turn this moment into blood. He drew a deep breath, let it out slowly, like he was strangling the familiar monster inside himself. He turned back, his voice still cold but no longer detonating. "Fine," he said. "Clean." Owen nodded, as if it was the most important sentence he'd ever heard from Graham. Within hours, a legal team arrived. Not the kind from the underworld, but a group introduced with real business cards, Real firms, real litigation records, people who knew how to kill an enemy with paper without laying a hand on them. They met in a small hospital conference room under harsh white lights and demanded everything be recorded in formal minutes. Graham wasn't used to that feeling. He was used to conversations where words became orders. Here, words became evidence, and evidence could save a person or bury them. He sat upright with his hands clasped, looking controlled. But inside he felt like he was standing on hot stone. Owen laid out the most important pieces he'd gathered since discovering the minute the camera feed was cut. Hallway badge swipe logs, a timeline grid, signs of video data edits, timestamp strings matching with a chill precision. There's a chain, Owen said, pointing to each point. User access, time of access, device of access, and it leads to an administrative-level account. That account is tied to an internal oversight committee. And on the list of authorized users is someone related to Quincy Hale. The attorneys kept writing, asked about retention, access rights, process, like surgeons searching for the exact artery. Graham heard Quincy Hale's name and felt anger surge, but he pushed it down, because he knew he wasn't allowed to become what they wanted him to become. Owen slid another packet forward, internal emails extracted legally through a data preservation demand, lines about risk, hospital image, controlling media after the storm night, and one short sentence that made the room go silent. Prioritize addressing destabilizing staff before external intervention. That staff member was Tessa. They'd chosen her as a shield. They'd chosen her as a sacrifice to cut out of the story right when Evelyn began to wake. Graham's hand tightened until his nails bit into his skin. But he didn't stand up and slam the table. He only said one sentence, hoarse and heavy. I want her back. The lead attorney answered calmly. To do that, we need cooperation with the DA. And right then, Rebecca Hart walked in. She didn't come in wearing victory. She came in like someone who'd predicted the trap and was watching to see whether the prey would spring it. She set a set of papers on the table, preservation orders and a request to open an independent investigation into possible security interference, record manipulation, and abuse of power by the Oversight Board. She looked at Graham. You chose the right way, she said. Don't disappoint me. Graham met her gaze. I want the truth, he said. And I want that nurse not crushed. Rebecca Hart gave a small nod, then said something that chilled the room further. I don't think she's being crushed by accident, she said. Someone wants her out of room 404 because she's living proof something happened. And someone wants you to react the old way, so I have cause to finish you. That line painted a red boundary in front of Graham, and he understood this wasn't only about a hospital or a nurse. This was a larger game, and his comatose parents were the bait. Owen opened another file, related to the crash. Not hospital records, but field reconstruction data he'd quietly had reviewed by an independent specialist, legally and through the proper channels. There are signs the vehicle was hit twice, Owen said. An initial collision, then a second force after the vehicle had already lost control, like someone made sure the outcome would be heavy enough that they wouldn't die, but also wouldn't wake quickly. Graham lifted his head, eyes sharp as a blade. Not dead, but powerless, he repeated, tasting the bitterness. Rebecca Hart watched him, voice low. A crash big enough to make you go feral, long enough to wear out your patience, clean enough that no one calls it murder right away, she said. If you retaliate recklessly, you'll be buried by your own reaction. That was the biggest reveal, and it sent a rare shiver through Graham, because it described the last 6 months of his life like a script. He'd made the whole city fear him. He'd erased enemies, and if Rebecca Hart wanted, she could label it all evidence of a monster. Quincy Hale didn't need to beat him with bullets. Hale only needed Graham to sign his own sentence with anger. Rebecca Hart placed terms on the table, an offer that was also a noose. I'll prioritize the corruption case around the board and the security interference if you keep everything calm, she said. No retaliation, no pressure on hospital staff, nothing that forces me to choose between truth and public safety. Graham stayed silent. In his world, calm meant weak. No retaliation meant inviting someone to step on your neck. Owen looked at him, eyes saying, this is the price of staying clean, the price of bringing Tessa back, the price of keeping your parents from becoming an excuse. Graham looked out the window at the post-storm sky, still gray, and in his head Evelyn's recorded voice from the speaker seemed to keep reading to a child afraid of the dark. He looked back at Rebecca Hart and nodded. Fine, he said. I'll keep it calm. But that nod wasn't only an agreement with the DA. It was a declaration to his own world, and he knew the consequence would come immediately. Owen's phone started vibrating nonstop. Messages from their people. Questions, complaints, warnings that the boss was getting soft. In the places where Graham had been worshipped for ruthlessness, restraint would be called weakness, and Graham accepted being called that. For the first time, because in room 404, a mother had just looked at him like a son, and he didn't want to lose that look again. The days after the meeting with the attorneys, and Rebecca Hart moved forward under a low, smoldering tension. There were no gunshots and no smashed walls, only calls, emails, data preservation requests, and minutes recorded like small bricks stacked into a wall against darkness in a suit. Tessa wasn't allowed back into the VIP unit. Her badge was locked. Her name hung in the system like a red question mark, and every time she passed the lower floor corridor, she still heard room 404's monitor inside her head, like the heartbeat of something she'd tied herself to. She was called in for a disciplinary interview, where they questioned her on every detail of the storm night, every time she turned on the speaker, every sentence she spoke to the patients, as if kindness required a license. This time she didn't go alone. Her attorney sat beside her, took notes, insisted every question follow process, insisted every accusation come with evidence. And the strangest part was that Tessa no longer felt like the child standing in an emergency hallway years ago. She still shook inside, but she wasn't swallowed. She began to understand that paperwork had once killed her brother, but it could also save her, if she knew how to make it speak the truth. The wage garnishment was raised first, like a noose they wanted to tighten fast. Her attorney opened the contract packet, pointed to the signing date, pointed to the portion showing the signer's age at that time, then demanded a match against notarization records and identity data. Tessa sat still, palms damp with sweat, but her eyes didn't flinch. When the date was set on the table like a number that couldn't be argued, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A financial contract bearing her signature while she was underage was void under the law, and any forced collection action based on it could become unlawful conduct by the collector. The collection representative tried to argue it was an old agreement, that Tessa had benefited, that she carried a moral obligation, but the attorney didn't let them hide behind morality. He demanded transaction proof, demanded they show where the money actually went, demanded they prove what Tessa received and when. And when they couldn't produce it, their confident tone shrank, like a shadow pulled into light. In the end, a letter arrived stating all enforcement actions were suspended, and the file would be reviewed. Tessa read it in her small kitchen under tired yellow light, and for the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar. Not explosive happiness, but clean relief, like someone had lifted a stone off her chest. At the same time, the hospital's internal investigation advanced in a direction the people who wanted her erased couldn't cover fast enough. Rebecca Hart and her team demanded system logs, demanded original camera data, demanded a forensic review of edit timestamps. When the timestamps were cross-checked, a truth surfaced like a crack running through a white wall. Someone had accessed and cut the hallway footage for exactly 1 minute outside room 404, and the account that executed the action belonged to an administrator, not the technical department. The administrator who signed Tessa's suspension was called in, and his answers sounded like a man reading a script he'd memorized. But paperwork shows no mercy when it's used correctly. Every login, every export command, every edit marker left a trace, and that trace reached the exact level of access Owen had warned about, high-level administrative badge access. The move to review Tessa's nursing license was paused, then reversed when the board was forced to admit most allegations rested on a distorted description of the storm night and a biased interpretation of her care methods. A short email from Human Resources arrived, stating the suspension was rescinded, her access would be restored, and her file would be updated according to investigative findings. Tessa read those lines with shaking hands, but this time not from fear of being crushed. She was watching something she'd never believed existed for people like her. Small justice, clean, delivered in black ink on white paper. She wasn't running from paperwork anymore. She was winning through paperwork. When her badge was activated again, and the elevator doors to the VIP floor opened, Tessa stepped into the corridor with the feeling of walking into a place that was both familiar and new. Lena Park saw her from a distance, eyes wet, but she only nodded, not daring to hug her, as if she feared the system was still watching. Tessa didn't blame her. She'd learned that other people's fear is its own prison. She went straight to the door of room 404. Her heart hammered when her hand touched the handle. The door opened, and the first sound she heard was the steady monitor, so familiar it almost made her break. Graham stood by the bed and turned. His eyes settled on her as if he'd held her there in memory through every day she'd been taken away. He didn't speak at first. He only tilted his head slightly, acknowledging she'd returned the right way. On the bed, Evelyn was more awake now. Her eyes stayed open longer. Her gaze had weight, even though her voice was still weak. Tessa stepped closer and gave her soft greeting like always, but her throat tightened. Evelyn looked at her, then reached out slowly, like someone learning her body again. Tessa took her hand gently, and then, unexpectedly, Evelyn squeezed more clearly than before. Not reflex, but intention. And then she spoke, voice rough. Only one short sentence, but each word landed perfectly, like a blade cutting through darkness and a blessing at the same time. You stayed. Tessa froze. She wanted to say more, to explain, to confess how close she'd come to quitting, but she didn't need to. That sentence said it for her. Graham leaned closer, eyes red, and no longer hiding. Evelyn turned to him, her gaze both gentle and stern, like a mother who still sees her child clearly no matter how many layers of armor he wears. She added one more sentence, slow and heavy, and Graham heard it like a new verdict that didn't come from a monitor, but from love. Become the kind of man worth staying for. The room went quiet, not quiet from fear, but quiet because that line made everything else unnecessary. Graham stood there, holding his mother's hand, looked at Tessa, then looked at his father still sleeping, and he understood something Quincy Hale had never understood. The real choice wasn't whether to fight or not fight, whether to beat or lose to Hale. The real choice was who he would be when he could no longer use darkness as an excuse. And when he looked back at the chair by the bed, the chair where he'd once sat like a powerless boss, he knew that from now on, he would have to learn how to sit here as a son, as a human being, if he wanted to deserve the words, become the kind of man worth staying for. In the days that followed, room 404 was no longer a place made only of machine sounds and whispers swallowed by the walls. It became a place with a real pulse, still slow and still fragile, but unmistakably alive. Evelyn stayed awake longer. Her eyes could track whoever walked in, and what moved Tessa most wasn't the medical progress itself, but the fact that Evelyn began to choose how to spend her limited strength, choosing to look, choosing to recognize, choosing to stay. Howard still slept most of the time, but his body began to answer with small signs an outsider could miss. A slight frown when someone called his name, a finger curling faintly when Graham spoke, a change in his breathing when Tessa adjusted the pillow into the right position. Doctor. Sloane called it slow progress with direction, and for the first time, the word waiting stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like a road. One evening, when Tessa came in for her shift, she saw Graham had been there early. No suit, no expensive coat, none of the presence of a boss that made people lower their eyes automatically. He wore a plain dark sweater. He looked so ordinary that if you didn't know, you might have thought he was just a son waiting for his parents to wake. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't speak in promises. He didn't offer anything that could become a leash. He only said something simple, like a man who had learned there are things that have to be said honestly and said at the right time. Thank you, he said, for staying when everyone wanted you to disappear. Tessa didn't answer right away. She'd heard many thank yous in her life. Some thank yous are used to close a story. Some are used to buy someone. Graham's didn't smell like either. It sounded like acknowledgement. Graham glanced down at his own hands, then continued, his voice not loud, but weighted. I'm dismantling the darkest part of what I built. Not to erase the past overnight, but so my parents can have a second chance without paying for it with filth. I know you don't need promises. I don't want to promise things I'm not sure I can keep. I'm only saying what's true. Tessa looked at him, not to judge, but to measure whether that truth could stand. She thought about the condition she'd set. Keep it clean, and I'll stay. And she realized he was doing something harder than fighting. He was accepting the loss of status inside his own world. Owen had reported that Hale's network was being mapped out through paperwork, timestamps, and a chain of data that couldn't be denied. And the people Hale had manipulated were starting to step away, as if they didn't want their fingers near that name anymore. Quincy Hale didn't vanish from Chicago like someone erased. He still existed. He still had relationships. He still knew how to smile in a boardroom. but what he lost was leverage. When the paperwork was already in the prosecutor's hands, when the trail had become a file, when the eyes of people who'd once stayed silent began to look back at him, he couldn't pull strings in the dark the way he used to. That was the softest twist of the story. No loud revenge, just a truth placed into light, and the light doing the rest. That night, Howard showed a clearer response. A faint squeeze when Graham spoke, and then a sigh, like he was trying to return from very far away. Tessa checked the numbers and gave Dr. Sloane a small nod. Progress. Graham didn't cheer. He only bent down and spoke softly like a prayer he'd never believed in before. "I'm here, Dad. I'll be here." When the shift was nearly over, Tessa gathered her chart and moved toward the door. Before she left, she paused for one beat. The monitor's steady rhythm sounded behind her, no longer like a verdict, but like ordinary time, like life being allowed to continue. Tessa looked at Evelyn, looked at Howard, looked at Graham, then placed her hand on the handle. She didn't look back again. She stepped into the hallway, where morning light was beginning to slip in through the glass at the far end, and she walked straight into it, like someone leaving the dark for the first time without needing to turn around. On a quiet morning, the rain had stopped, and the wind had become nothing more than the city's soft breathing. Evelyn sat propped up on pillows, her eyes brighter, and when Graham held Howard's hand, Howard squeezed back, weak but real, enough to make the whole room fall silent with happiness. Tessa stood beside them, documenting by procedure, but inside her there was a strange, steady peace. She returned to her regular unit afterward, still a night shift nurse, still working long corridors, still facing hard cases. But she wasn't invisible anymore, not the person the system pushed around until no one remembered her name. Graham stood by the window, staring at his own reflection, a man who had spent years building a fortress of fear, only to realize he was the only one locked outside. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed orders of ruin, and felt a strange, heavy urge to do something. Simple. When Tessa arrived, he wasn't looming. He was just there, holding a small paper bag, as if it were more valuable than his empire. "My mother said she feels calmer when she smells this," he said, his voice missing its usual edge. Graham still came to visit. Not like a storm that made everyone afraid, but like a sun carrying fruit, carrying jasmine tea, sitting and listening to his mother breathe. Chicago outside remained Chicago, hard, loud, rushing, but in room 404, compassion finally held its ground. It didn't have to shout. It only had to exist. And the lesson of this story may live in the simplest truth. When life pushes us to the edge, what holds us there isn't always power or money. Sometimes it's someone brave enough to stay at the right moment, a truth written down the right way, and a choice for kindness repeated every day. If you're listening to this story and it touched something in your heart, remember you can be someone's Tessa, or you can be a Graham learning how to love without hurting. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share to support us, and so you won't miss more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? And in real life, have you ever had a moment when a small kindness changed someone completely? Leave a comment so we can hear what you felt from the deepest place in your heart. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.